Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Inoapps and Oracle webinar on developing data strategies without system boundaries. Um, I'd like to start today by introducing you to your speakers. To begin with, my name is Jennifer Tavano Gallagher. I'm the Vice President of Higher Education for Inoapps. I have 25 years experience in the higher education sector, both in the UK and in North America, and have been involved in the implementation of most of the application pillars or kind of key application pillars you would see at a university, whether that's student information systems, HR and finance, or constituent management implementations. I'd also like to introduce you to my colleague, Matt. Matt, do you want to say a few words about yourself?
Sure, thanks, Jen. First, everybody, nice to meet you all. My name is Matt Rawlings. I'm the EPM practice lead here at Inoapps. I've been doing EPM implementations for just about 20 years now, and also around 10 years of finance transformation as well. So finance transformation really is, there's process elements to it, there's modeling, chart of accounts design, that sort of thing. So it's not purely going to be a technical sort of run through on this particular webinar. There's going to be an awful lot of finance process and how to take your organization from an FP&A perspective and push it into the future.
Great, thanks, Matt. And then last but certainly not least, John Gardner from Oracle. John, do you want to say a few words about yourself?
Yeah, hi everybody. I'm John Gardner, a director at Oracle. I lead business development and business strategy for EPM across the EMEA.
Great, thanks, John. I also want to give you a short introduction to Inoapps. I'm assuming everybody on this call is already very familiar with what Oracle does, but we are an Oracle partner and an Oracle only partner. That's all we do. That said, we do everything Oracle, whether that is the on-premise applications, especially e-business and PeopleSoft, or whether it's the new cloud applications. And we do all pillars, HCM, finance, and CX. We also do technical development using Oracle tools. So whether that's custom pieces of development or products using Oracle's platform as a service, or doing things like migrating your on-premise services so that they can be hosted on Oracle Cloud Infrastructure, we can help you out in that regard. And we also have a robust managed services practice that can support an organization in all the different ways they use Oracle products. So today specifically, we're going to look at connected planning within a higher education environment. Really, this started out a few months ago when Alex McNeil from Oracle and I spoke at the Higher Education Partners Network and just really set a vision of what connected planning could look like within a university and some of the things you might want to think about on your journey to a connected planning environment. And today what we're really hoping to do is take that to the next level of detail and really look at the best practice there in terms of things you need to think about with your data strategy, the process design and re-engineering that might be required, and also some thoughts around how you would do your systems design and implementation. To cover all that off, we're going to start by hearing from John about connected planning best practices and setting the vision for that. Then we're going to hand over to Matt, and he's going to take us through some key areas in terms of, building that roadmap. How do we eat the elephant of getting us from where most unis are today, which is, really disconnected systems and siloed planning teams, to a place where we have a cohesive, connected use of our university data assets. We're also going to talk about the art of the possible and the kinds of data challenges that we may encounter along the way, and how we enable some of these processes to support the connected planning solution, and then some of the key questions we want to think about when we're starting to design that solution. So, how are we going to get our data aligned? How are we going to bring the organization along with us, etc. And with that, I'm going to hand over to you, John,
Okay.
and you can help us understand what we could potentially achieve.
Thanks everybody for joining the webinar today. I'm going to talk about reimagining finance and connected plans across your enterprise. One of the things that most organizations have issues with is being able to see what's going on between the whole of the organization, the whole of the university in one go. We tend to have lots of decentralized plans, and what we're going to do today is look at those in a bit more detail and trying to give you some ideas of how you can improve that situation. So at the moment, you may recognize this model yourself. You've got a lot of student planning going on. You've got infrastructure planning and background planning and HR planning and admissions and so forth, but they're all done on separate spreadsheets that aren't really connected. We do the operational planning in our own little silos and then move those into finance on spreadsheets, on emails, on conversations. But they're not actually then able to then really connect with one another. So when I change a plan within the student numbers, I don't necessarily have the ability to change those plans, how they affect our infrastructure. So they become very cumbersome and they're not agile at all. And what we want to do is try and improve that situation, because when they're not connected together properly, it introduces a lot of risk within the organization. They become disconnected. We don't know what's going on. And then that changes the budget and the forecasting cycle into just a tick box exercise, so that we try and get the plan done as soon as possible. We don't really gain any value from it. We're not able to really tell what's going on in our organization because it's just so fragile and it doesn't give us what we want. So that's the situation that we want to change. We want to try and get the organization to see far more what's going on within the organization at any one point in time, and that have all those points connected to one another, so that when we make a change in one, we can see it reflected in other areas. When we do that, that's going to be able to give us a lot more vision on our long-range planning. So we're going to be able to have both our financial plans and our operational plans linked together. We can use driver-based planning, we can use trend planning and predictive analysis, and that gives us a much better, more robust process to produce our budget and forecast, and then do our variance analysis from it, which will then give us a lot more information about how our organization allocates cost. Where are our costs built up? Where are our elements within our organization where we can start looking at growth? What's really driving the university? What's driving our student numbers? What's driving our courses and our course viability? We can start understanding a bit more about what's going on in the organization and start discovering some insight. So when we look at our own internal management reporting, we can really start to gain some insight into what's driving the organization, where we can really grow. So what we want to be able to do is have a connection between our student planning, our course viability planning, what's going on in our curriculum, our admissions, but having them all connected to one another, so that when we make a change in one, we can see that change reflected in other areas. Those are, of course, still connected to finance, but when we then have them connected between one another, we take more ownership back. So those individual operational areas have an ability to see what's going on within the rest of the organization, and finance still has a really good view of what's going on across the entire business. So we'd be able to then not only increase our visibility, but increase our ability to have a number of iterations of our forecast. Because we start moving away from manual processes, we automate those processes and we can do much more. So we can start doing some modeling, strategic modeling. What happens if we change a different number of students? What happens if we change the number of campuses? What happens if we change any of those elements? And we can see how that reflects with other areas within the organization, and we can do that time and time again because we've got an automated process to do that. When we get to that point, we can then start seeing how we can then predict what will happen in the university. What we can predict is how the numbers of students coming in or anything that's external to the organization starts reflecting within the university, and then model for that. And then that gives us the ability to then bring in additional operational data, which again enhances what we're doing as an organization. We can start seeing more and more, and that then again, as I mentioned before, gives us the ability to start really growing the organization and seeing where any of the costs may be leaking within some of these back office areas. That then gives us a lot more stable environment, a stable platform to work out where we're going forward. So that just gives you a highlight. Matt, I know is going to go into a lot more depth in that, so I'm going to hand over to Matt. He's going to give you a lot more detail behind some of those thoughts.
Thanks, John. As we think about an organization's journey from where they are today to where they want to be, it all starts with building the right roadmap. And that is incredibly important, because depending on where you are on the maturity scale of your FP&A or your finance organization, your approach is going to be very different. So what I've seen historically is organizations that are really in the growth phase, where they have a lot of Excel-based processes and they aren't even really using systems yet. It becomes less of a focus on a transformation and more of a focus on how can we start kind of scaling our business? How can we start automating our processes? How can we standardize certain items, right? So we'll kind of talk through a little bit of going from Excel to using EPM just as a repository, where we're going to be focusing on leveraging the tool as one version of the truth, right? Making sure that the data that's being reported on is accurate and timely. Organizations will then move from, instead of using it as a repository where it's a lot of manual input and manual calculations in Excel and then uploaded, to being a driver-based planning solution. And this is really where you're going to start leveraging the power of the cloud, right? At least from an Oracle perspective here. As you dig into driver-based planning, you're going to have a simplistic view. You're going to have a more complicated model than you ideally would like. So as you start to understand how to leverage the tool, it will be a little bit not really optimal per se, but you'll probably have between 50 and 75 drivers. As your organization learns, you will start to realize that we don't want to overcomplicate our planning models. Let's have a rationalized driver-based planning model. Let's do some statistical analysis to figure out what drivers are the most reliable. What are the items that are going to better enable us to answer the questions of why is our business changing? And the more complicated that your model is, the harder it is to answer those questions. And then finally, as we start to get to world-class, and so I have 2030 on this slide here, but that is typically what it's going to take for an organization to go from where they are today to where they need to be in world-class, in terms of where peers will likely be in terms of world-class in 2030. Not many organizations today are leveraging a lot of machine learning and predictive planning models, where they're leveraging data science focused competencies to drive their forecast forward. And so as we think about all of these items, it's important to understand what we're doing, where we're doing it, when we're doing it, so that way we can take the organization along with us on this journey. And it's really broken down into the three classic areas. We have people and culture, process, and technology. It's really important to not go more than one rung at a time, just because organizations typically don't have too much, we'll call it appetite for change, to go from Excel-based to predictive. It creates an awful lot of noise in the organization. It creates a lot of challenges from an adoption perspective, and it creates a lot of confusion. So having your roadmap be very clear, so that way you can achieve success and you can achieve incremental benefits as you go up this ladder, is incredibly important. So let's talk a little bit about what the elements of a transformation are. So if you're at the very start of your journey, where you're doing most Excel-based processes, you are not going to be doing a full-on redesign of all of your organization structure and processes. You're really looking just to implement a system. Let's leverage it so that way you have one version of the truth, and let's automate some of those processes, right? So it's going to be more of a fire, aim, fire approach. We'll implement a system, and then after about a 2-year period, then look to do your transformation, because it gives your organization the opportunity to learn what the capabilities of the tool are. And then you can start to really understand and build out what your future state should look like. Now, it's fire, aim, fire because you're implementing a system. Then you're going to redesign your processes. And then once you understand what those processes need to look like, you will then re-implement your system or go through a lot of enhancements to make sure that it's going to be sitting on top of the right processes. So digging into each step here, let's just kind of start from the bottom. Target operating model, very strategic. It's effectively structuring your organization in terms of how, like, what are the responsibilities, who's accountable for what, How is the organization really structured, and where people sit, and how are they incented to be able to drive the strategy forward? Very foundational in nature. Then we get to process design. Process design is the tactical way on which the operating model actually works. How are the handoffs between departments working? How are you running your management review cycles? What are the different and key reports that you're going to run? What are the questions that you're going to ask throughout the planning process, etc.? Once you go through and actually identify all of the different areas that you're going to be designing, right, in terms of processes, maybe it's workforce planning, your income statement, your balance sheet, student level analysis, that sort of thing, then you're going to move into modeling. And modeling arguably is a component of process design, but modeling falls into two different phases here. First, you have data modeling, all right? And data modeling is about understanding the different data elements that you're going to have for a particular grouping of processes and accounts. So let me give you an example. When we talk data modeling, it's about understanding the different slices of data that you need to consume from a reporting perspective, and also you want to generate from a planning perspective. So if we think about revenues, what level of detail do we need and want to be able to understand from a revenue perspective? Or do we want to look at revenue by program? Do we want to look at revenue by funding source? Do we want to look at revenue by student type? These, when we think about modeling, it's usually the by X, and it gives us the idea of how the application actually will end up being structured. The second element of modeling is statistical modeling. And statistical modeling is where you're doing statistical analysis and you're identifying how exactly you're going to be executing your budgets and your forecasts. What are the methodologies and calculations you're going to use to generate those forecasts? How are you calculating your KPIs? And you want to be able to do this because you'll have a more efficient and effective driver selection in a simplified model that gets you the most accurate forecast that's most transparent. Then we get to the systems implementation. Now, systems implementation, there's really not much to say about it. It is very much a technical tool that you're putting on top of your modeling, your process design, and by default, your target operating model. It is an enabling tool, all right? And then finally, once you get your system in there, then you start to look on how to automate everything. It's going to be a multi-step or multi-phase process to fully automate your forecast or your plan to be able to get to that really efficient end state. So as we start to think about the maturity curve and the roadmap, what does this actually look like if you wanted to try and get to best practice, right, or best in class? So the very bottom left here, you're going to end up starting with the recommended approach, which is you're going to start your initiative, you're going to go through and you're going to implement a driver-based planning tool. Don't necessarily redesign all of your processes if you're leveraging Excel, for example, because it's just going to end up being maybe a little bit of a bridge too far. You might not have all of those competencies in-house just yet. And then once you implement the tool, then you start with process design. Then you redesign your processes, how you're going to actually be executing your plan, your forecast. Are you doing top-down planning, or are you doing bottom-up? Or are you going to do a top-down then bottom-up? There's many different flavors of how you can execute that. Once you redesign your processes, you need to then work on your data. Data is incredibly important. You need to make sure that you have the appropriate infrastructure. You need to make sure that the data is normalized. And by normalized, it means we need to make sure that the data is consistent. It all tells the same story. Are we going to be able to pull data from multiple systems that have like-for-like analysis? Do they all have the same level of detail from a data element perspective? For example, program. Do we have all of our costs structured by cost center, right? These are all of the different elements that we would want to make sure that we incorporate from a data perspective. Then we start getting more into best practice. Now, the challenge here is if we were to scale this out based on time, it typically takes about 5 years once you implement your systems from a data perspective to get enough data at the right level of detail, at the right quality to be able to actually use machine learning. It takes about 5 years of data to drive that forward. Now, one could argue that you don't need to have your systems running for 5 years. You could just map your data, so it's at that level of detail. But what's important to remember is that mapping your data into having all of these different data elements is not the same as categorizing that on the way in. It then starts to get toward a cultural shift where you need to make sure that you trust the numbers, you trust these machine learning models. There's going to be a series of trial and error, because as a finance person myself, how do you teach a tool to know when it's wrong? You don't, right? There are going to be operational realities that we simply don't have the ability to have the system understand when it's wrong. And we need to then guide that process. So once we actually start executing the cultural shift, we then need to redesign our processes to leverage these tools in the data science-based process to get to that fully automated, system-generated or touchless baseline, which we can then adjust. So as we start to get to the latter half here, this is where it gets incredibly complex, where it's focused on lots of different machine learning models at different levels of detail. You then have operational adoption, finally resulting in the automation of data-driven decisions. So things like how many programs should we have? What is the optimal student size or per class, for example? How can we, what are the profitability decisions that we need to be able to make? Making quantitative judgments on data is incredibly important, but it's a huge, huge path to get there. So let's talk a little bit about the data challenges. And because once we understand the roadmap, now we need to figure out what the key areas are from a problem perspective and how can we solve them. First and foremost, we have disconnected data. We're going to be talking a little bit about data sets, I believe, on the next slide or the next 2 slides. And how can we resolve them? So if data sets exist in all sorts of disparate systems, how do we consume that data? How can we report on that data? Does the data even mean the same thing, which we'll actually talk about in a couple bullets here? But the idea of having disconnected data is one of the biggest roadblocks that organizations have. And thinking about what your strategy is, what data sets you're going to bring into the system, why you're bringing it into the system, and who are the stakeholders, and what level of detail are you bringing it in at? Those are all incredibly important questions. And so we need to make sure that data is consistent and there is a unifying platform for you, and that's where EPM will come in. Next, we need to focus on data quality. Errors just abound in systems. It happens, right? Sometimes if you just think about the most common one that I've found in my experience is employee-related data or faculty-related data. You may have people at the wrong pay grade. You may have people with the wrong start date. So for example, let's say that a person was at the university for 5 years and then they left and then they came back. What does start date really mean? How do you calculate how long someone has been in place if they were at the organization for 5 years and then left and then came back? These are the sorts of things that we need to make sure that we identify, or even missing data. Maybe somebody doesn't have their appropriate start date filled out. Maybe there are certain attributes or properties of that employee that don't exist. And that happens at almost every single client that I have ever encountered, especially when it comes to workforce data. So understanding what data quality issues you have is incredibly important, so that way you can remediate that and you can cleanse that data. EPM is the absolute optimal tool to be able to handle this, because you'll be able to report on it very easily. You'll be able to identify, oh, this person is just not correct. We now need to fix that data in the upstream source system. And then finally, this is one, and I think a lot of organizations just overlook this. It's a data dictionary. It's just a fancy word for saying, what does our data mean? Do we have the same definition of what our data is? And a great example for higher education is, how do we define a student, or a student count for that matter? Total number of students in the organization are going to be defined differently depending on who you ask. What is an active student? How many active students do we have? Does quote unquote number of students, does that incorporate faculty that are students or not? And you may absolutely end up with multiple versions of the truth, because these KPIs, these statistics are very likely to have the same name, but they don't mean the same thing. So understanding and creating discrete names that the organization agrees on, so that way when you look at a number, you're all talking about the same thing, right? So the first and most important element of systems is just getting your data in a place that everyone understands what it means and has a common definition. So how can EPM solve all of these problems? I mean, because that's really why we're here today. EPM does a few things. First and foremost, it has the appropriate solution architecture. The cloud has all of these pre-built modules, and just to tell a little bit of the story of the evolution of this tool and why the cloud is so important, going back 10, 15 years ago, it used to take anywhere from 12 to 24 months to execute an implementation. Now with the advent of the cloud and all of these pre-built modules, it takes significantly less time to be able to roll these out. Arguably less than 50% of what it used to be, because now all of these best practices are built into the tool. So it has a workforce module to do labor planning, right? It has a P&L, a balance sheet, and a cash flow. There's a project planning module that you can use. There's also strategic modeling to do scenario analysis and modeling and what if analysis. There's a capital planning module, which is equally important, right? So there's all of these different modules, and each one is fit for purpose. So it gives you the ability to drill down to very granular levels of detail and not just satisfy summary levels of reporting. It's incredibly unifying. It's incredibly easy to use. From an integration perspective, there's a built-in integration tool that will allow us to pull data directly from other source databases that the university has. And we also can load in just flat files, right? That is equally important. So when we think about integrations in general, we have the ability to make sure that we can write back to databases. So if we're pulling all of these databases in and we want to export all of this out, there's native functionality in the tool to do something called a write back. We can drill back to individual transactions and purchase orders and invoices if we are so inclined as well. There's a lot of advanced things that we can do from an integration lens. And then lastly, it has best-in-class reporting. So you can have extremely highly formatted reports for certain external reporting and stakeholders. There's the ability to go ahead and also do ad hoc reporting in Excel as well. So a lot of competitors have tried to mirror and mimic the Smart View tool, which everybody loves. It is by far the linchpin of the overall tool from a reporting perspective. Finance and accounting people absolutely love it. It is just absolutely the easiest thing to use, because you no longer need to go to the web to do all of this reporting. You live in your Excel world, because everybody does, I do, and it allows you to pretty much format any report that you want in Excel and get at the data nearly instantly. So from an art of the possible perspective, right, it's important to understand what you can do in the tool to actually figure out what to do and where to go, because this is all about education. We need to make sure that we understand the capabilities before we actually move forward. Otherwise, we're not going to be making educated and informed decisions. So when we start thinking about data sets, this is where it comes in. And each data set is incredibly important to understand, because there's different stakeholders associated with different data sets and different levels of detail. So as you're going through your journey, you definitely want to make sure that you identify and you do stakeholder analysis. You understand what data sets are important to them, what levels of detail are important, and what data elements are relevant for each one of these data sets. So if we start with HR, for example, we have salary and wage information, there's benefit information, there's employee attributes that are going to be important to some people, there's automatic grade progression, for example, that is going to be incredibly important from an automation perspective. We need to make sure that we bring all of that data in if it's relevant to us, if that's part of our strategy. Now, instead of tracking each and every single one of these items, it's just important to talk about the different buckets that you have. So HR, financials, and student information we can bring in. And this is data that we can consume, but it's also equally important to track the different data sets that we're going to need to generate for consumption by other groups, right? So there's track reporting, there's AFR, there's other external sorts of reports and reporting that we're going to need to facilitate. And we need to make sure that we look at this from the lens of two different things. First, we need to make sure that we look at this from a reporting lens. What do we need to report on out of the system? And then secondly, we need to identify and understand what different data sets that we need to produce from a planning perspective, and what is the appropriate level of detail. Now, as we start to talk a little bit about level of detail, it is definitely an interesting conversation, because typically what you want to report on is going to be at a lower level of detail, at least from an actuals perspective, than you want to plan it. Because if we planned at every single base intersection, every single account, every single employee for every single cost center, department, program, it would take many hours, weeks, and months to effectively produce our forecast or our plan, right? So typically you're going to be planning at a higher level of detail than your forecast. Now, once we have our data sets enabled, we then need to figure out how we're going to enable our process, right? And at the end of the day, a system exists purely to enable what our processes are trying to accomplish. So first and foremost, we want to automate, right? EPM is a tool. We want to automate manual activities and become more efficient and effective. We want to integrate all of those relevant data sets based on what we deem as priority. And again, it's going to be phased. You can go through the big bang approach if you want, but more often than not, it becomes a phased approach to figure out what you want to do, how you want to do it, and when you want to do it. What questions, what business questions are you going to answer throughout this process? Then you're going to go through and understand, all right, what modeling, what scenario modeling, what if analysis do I need to perform on my data for my business and operations through the use of this technology, right? This is where you can go forward and have predictive planning if you want. You can get really advanced and really creative with your what if modeling, or you can just elect to do this offline, at least in the interim, right? That is always an option. Once you go through that process, then it's the negotiation. How do you negotiate with this tool? How do you enable the process of making sure that budgets get allocated to the right programs, the right cost centers, the right departments to achieve the goals, right? Because everyone always wants more budget. And it becomes a quantitative way on how to make sure that we're doing the right thing for the university and for the students. And then lastly, it's the operationalization, right? And that's a word that I think has a different meaning to a lot of people. Operationalize to me means having data at the right level of detail to manage and track operational activities. Many people will argue, and I used to be in this camp as well, that this is a finance tool and it should only be for finance, and operations needs their own tool. That can't be the path for the future, because we need integrated systems. We need the ability to manage our organization and to be able to make sure that we're providing the right information to the right people. And that takes a different lens to make sure that we're being successful. So let's go into the key questions and solutions here. So the first question is, how do we actually get there? How do we get to connected planning when we have all of these different and disparate data sources? First and foremost, it starts with data modeling, right? From a process lens, we need to make sure that we identify all of the different data elements which are relevant. What are we doing? Do we have data at a program level that is required? What different cuts of student data do we need? Do we need data by student type? Do we need data by program? Do we need student data by part-time, by full-time? Do we need to be able to track what the international students are versus domestic? Do we need to track students that are, maybe on sabbatical or something of that sort? These are the different things that you'll want to make sure that you understand and track. That is one of the absolute linchpins of the requirements and design, is understanding what different cuts of data you need to bring into the system, right? That will then drive what systems need to feed this Oracle EPM tool. Then we figure out our constraints, all right? And this starts at the planning calendar. So the planning calendar is a concept, just understanding of who is going to do what and when throughout the year, and how much time do you really have available. Because we all have a budget cycle, we all have a forecast cycle, we all have actuals that we need to make sure that we understand. We need to do budget versus actual analysis. So as we look at our calendar, we will have constraints put on us, right? And we would all like to be able to have a perfect budget or a perfect forecast, but what matters is that we figure out what the time frame is that we need to arrive at the end result, and then we need to right size the effort to fit back into what that planning calendar is. And the driver for that is going to end up being level of detail and materiality. So referencing this slide again, this is where the data model comes in. We need to understand basically by P&L account grouping, by balance sheet grouping, by different data set, for example, HR, what data elements do you need and what do you need to track them by? How do you want to be able to push this forward, right? If you have a specific student application, for example, to be able to track different student types, that can be incredibly important. Now, one of the interesting elements, specifically as it relates to data models, is the data that you have right now and the data needs that you have right now are likely to be different than the data needs in the future. So you may need a significantly lower level of granularity from a student perspective, or if we're talking about a corporate, right? So a for-profit organization where maybe they're making widgets. They need to understand their volumes because each volume that they're producing is going to end up having a different cost pool associated with it. And so each one of these items is important, not to just think about the data sets which are required right now, but also in the future and the level of detail that you may need and having that vision for what things look like, right? Having that data model established now is good, but understanding how that data model may change in the future is equally important. And again, that's where it gets back to, are you doing a transformation or are you just doing a systems implementation to kind of get started on that journey? Thinking forward, the lens that I use is, if you're going to change your processes or you want to incorporate a change in somewhere between 2 and 5 years, design for it now. So that way it's not a rebuild later. Now we start talking about how to right size the effort. At the end of the day, each planning event that we have, so it's the long range plan or the strategic plan, which is again, the 5-year model that you might be working with, you need to do that at a higher level of detail, just because it is, you have to forecast for the entire business for 5 years. You very likely are not going to be doing this by cost center, by month. You're not going to be doing or you shouldn't really be doing an employee by employee view going out 5 years and adjusting at that level of detail. Once you actually go forward and you have your LRP, then you need to start figuring out, what does our annual plan look like? How are you executing your annual plan? Are you doing a top-down plan, which is what we call target setting? And if you do target setting at a top-down, how do you allocate those down to the base levels to come up with what that initial data set looks like? That allocation is called the target cascade in the finance transformation world, right? Then you need to figure out, what level of detail are you going to adjust at? Then once you actually start doing your plan, what level of detail do you need to be able to actually execute and manage that plan from an operational perspective? What is your time horizon? Are you going to be doing this on a monthly basis, or are you doing this on a quarterly basis? And then lastly, as we start to think about this, the amount of effort that you have for the plan, most organizations will finish their plan. And again, we'll talk best practice here. It takes about a month for an organization to start their plan to when it's approved and it's done. Some organizations may take as long as 3 months to be able to do it. And if we think about that, how much effort needs to go into the plan to have it be correct to do it in a month? We have a lot more time than if we were to do a monthly forecast, which means that if we want to execute a forecast successfully and we want to retain our people and not burn them out, we need to do our forecast at a higher level of detail. We need to identify what is material and what levels of detail are important to us for analytics and reporting. Now, one of my favorite ways to be able to think about this is, you may have financial accounts or natural accounts in your chart of accounts for postage versus freight. It's not really important to be able to plan those separately. Now they exist, but where does the materiality sit? Do we need to adjust $100? Probably not. But agreeing at an organizational level where the cost elements are from a materiality perspective and what you want to adjust is incredibly important. Now, materiality is just one lens to be able to do this on. There's other important lenses as well. You may have a strategic focus on one particular year for a cost element, which may fall far below the threshold of materiality. But again, it's strategic and important. Now, we're not really going to talk about predictive planning because that's a little bit of Tomorrowland, but predictive planning is something which you need to make sure that you design your processes around. It can drastically reduce the overall amount of time that is required to produce a plan or a forecast by generating that first cut of your data, where you're, instead of authoring all of the data from scratch, you're just editing the data and adjusting the data. And again, it all boils down to, what are you trying to do from a transformation perspective, and how are you trying to accomplish this? So a lot of what we're talking about here, if we go back a few minutes, this is all process related. This actually isn't system related. We're talking about modeling. We're talking about process design. We're talking about how the forecast, how the plan needs to work. These are all transformational elements. And so as we start to think about this, this is less of a system and more of, what do we want our business to do? And then we're just going to collect all of those things. Those become the requirements, and to a lesser extent design, for the actual system. Next, how do we align on and monitor KPIs? This is going to be a little bit more of the same in terms of a focus on process, because this is really change management. This is transformation related. This is process related. So first and foremost, as we start talking about KPIs, we need to interview our stakeholders. We need to understand what KPI each stakeholder is using. And it's not just FP&A people that we're going to have to talk to. We're going to need to talk to a lot of different people. There's going to be admissions people. There's going to be funding. There's going to be research that we need to understand, and what KPIs they use. And we shouldn't necessarily take the lens of what is the most common KPI, but we should also look at what are the other KPIs that people are going to use, and what is their reliance on them. Maybe a seldomly used KPI that's only being used by one group within the organization is a superior KPI. And the other thing that we need to remember is that if we neglect certain stakeholders, if we don't include certain KPIs, it drives the incentive and it drives the behavior to go offline and to do things outside of the system. And it creates an intentional workaround that, hey, this data is not in the system, and people are disincented to actually use the system the way that we would want to. So we need to understand the decisions that we're going to make when we talk to these stakeholders are going to directly drive culture, and it's going to directly impact the usage of the tool. Once we figure out what each stakeholder wants and what they need out of the system, and again, it should be prioritized. We're going to have primary, secondary, and tertiary stakeholders. Then we need to figure out the data element. What is the availability of the data, and what is the traceability of this data? So if we have some obscure KPIs, maybe the calculation is so complex and it's relying on data sets which are entirely manual, right? It's almost as if someone was divining the data and coming up with this model that no one else can prove. At the end of the day, we have to question the validity of these KPIs, and we need to then figure out whether this is something that we need to fix on the data side, whether this is a KPI that we should even be using as an organization. Because if you can't prove out, if you can't audit the way that a KPI is actually being generated, and you can't answer business questions based on that KPI, I would argue that's probably not the best use of someone's time. It's not the best use of a KPI. And then finally, we get to key business reports. Now, this one is last, and I would actually argue that this is probably the single most important one. This probably needs to be the first step, but you have to start somewhere. Consuming the key business reports is absolutely critical when it comes to understanding this. We should go through all of the different reports that are being run. We need to understand what reports are being run during the close, what reports are being used to drive management review meetings, what reports are being used to drive alignment on the budget, what are the KPIs that are on there? Do we have any different KPIs that, and again, getting back to what a data dictionary was that we talked about earlier, do we have KPIs that mean different things across different areas of the businesses? If so, we need to then identify what those are, rename the ones that and make them mean the same thing. So when we're talking, it's apples to apples, not apples to watermelons. So understanding the different elements here in terms of what each stakeholder wants, the data sets that are being consumed and the KPIs that are being generated, and then also what is being produced on these different reports. Now, one of the, we'll call it the least understood or explored elements of process design that most organizations face is understanding how to drive specific meetings and with management or executives throughout the year based on which reports you're going to run. Are you going to run the same reports every single day throughout the close? Or do you want to then transition, say on day one, we only want to run revenue and enrollment. And day two, do we want to focus on X sort of costs? Do we want to look at research on day three? Do we want to look at grants and funding? Understanding what reports that you're leveraging during what section of the year in your planning calendar is very important. And all of that should be brought out in your process design phase. And lastly, how do we make sure that the entire university is engaged in the planning process and monitoring actuals against the plan? Well, this is incredibly challenging. This is a change management exercise, and it boils down to, do we have the right structure within the organization? Are we incenting people to use the tool? Are we answering all of the appropriate stakeholders' questions? So if we go back to the prior slide here, interviewing stakeholders is incredibly important. So if we want to make sure that everyone is engaged, we have to do a full stakeholder analysis here. We need to make sure that we interview them. We need to make sure that we understand what they need to get out of the tool. And then as we bring them along through the process, did we build all the KPIs into the tool? Do they have all of the data elements that they need to accomplish their job and their role? And then lastly, how are we managing the change as we're going from current state to future state? We can have the best tool in the world, we can have the best processes, but if we don't communicate effectively, if we don't manage that change, the probability that the tool goes unused or there's a resistance to change and adoption issues is very, very high. Change management is absolutely critical. Now, it doesn't take a lot of effort per se to make sure that you manage the change successfully, but having a clear roadmap, communicating from the start of the program to the end of the program, having everybody be aligned with what the goals are and what the vision is, and then finally, what is the strategy that we're going to use to tackle this vision? And then tactically speaking, how are we going to do this? Getting feedback at key points in the process is very important. And then lastly, of course, making sure that we understand things from a training perspective. So I want to come back to the very first slide that I mentioned here. And it boils down to, where are you on the maturity scale? Are you Excel based? Are you somewhere in the middle? Is this something that you just need to kind of get a tool to automate your existing processes? Or is this something where you really need to make sure that you need to do a full-on transformation because your organization is ready, right? Understand where you are on the maturity scale, build the right roadmap for your organization so that way you have the highest probability of success, and it's going to cost you the least amount of money, right? Because at the end of the day, efficiency does matter. So appreciate everybody's time today. Does anybody have any questions? Okay, great. Well, I appreciate everybody's time. Thanks for joining. And please reach out to us. We want to be able to help. This is very much a partnership here. And if there's any questions that you have in terms of how to start your journey, what does that roadmap look like? How do we get to connected planning? How can we become more efficient? We're happy to chat. So I appreciate you all today. I hope you have a good rest of your week, and thanks for joining. Appreciate it.